Bart Ehrman is the skeptic's go-to guy when they're looking for a negative verdict on the New Testament, but just look how sloppy he is. In Jesus Interrupted, he claims that Paul contradicts Acts. He writes, according to Paul's account, the Jerusalem Council was only the second time he had been to Jerusalem. According to Acts, it was his third prolonged trip there. It appears that the author of Acts has confused some of Paul's itinerary, possibly intentionally, for his own purposes. So Bart says that Acts is straight up lying, but there's a big problem. Paul never says there were 2 and only 2 trips to Jerusalem. Ehrman just read that into the text. In Galatians 1:18-19, Paul writes, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James the Lord's brother. That was his first post-conversion visit. Then in Galatians 2:1, Paul adds, then after 14 years I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along with me. Now, where does Paul ever say that this was his second trip? He doesn't. Again, Ehrman just reads that into the text. Paul's point in Galatians wasn't to provide a comprehensive travelogue, it was to prove that his gospel didn't come secondhand from the apostles. That's why he only mentions trips that mattered for that argument. But as Ehrman points out, Acts does mention another trip in between. In Acts 11, Paul and Barnabas carry famine relief to Jerusalem, and Luke ties this famine to the reign of Claudius, and Josephus, the Jewish historian, records a famine in Judea during Claudius's reign, right around AD 46 through 48. Now, think about it. If Luke were inventing stories about Paul to prop him up, why on earth would he be making up a boring relief delivery errand? Fabricated legends are flashy, not Paul was the apostles' errand boy and dropped off alms in Jerusalem. On the Myth Vision podcast, Ehrman pushes back by saying that Paul's collection was at the end of his life, and he references Romans 15:25-27. Showing that it was not right at the beginning of his ministry. But all this shows is that his famine trip actually fits Paul's long-term ministry pattern. Acts 11:30 says that Paul and Barnabas gave relief to the elders. That matches the larger structured collection Paul later organized among the Gentile churches. In other words, Luke shows what Paul was doing early on what we know he later scaled up. Now, let's take a look at the second larger collection. We can actually track it step by step. In 1 Corinthians 16, Paul gives instructions about the collection while still in Ephesus. In 2 Corinthians 9, written from Macedonia, he describes arranging the contribution there. In Romans 15, written from Greece, Paul says that he's about to deliver the funds to Jerusalem. That sequence dovetails exactly with Acts 19-21. Paul leaves Ephesus, travels through Macedonia, spends 3 months in Greece, and finally arrives in Jerusalem. And then, when Paul later stands before Felix, he explicitly testifies, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. Now notice that, after several years. That's Paul himself acknowledging multiple visits and multiple occasions of aid. Ehrman somehow missed that, but it single-handedly collapses his whole claim. This is where William Paley's observation hits like a hammer. Writing in the 18th century, he pointed out how Paul's letters and Acts independently interlock around the collection. He writes, here therefore at length, but fetched from 3 different writings, we have obtained the several circumstances we inquired after which the epistle to the Romans brings together vis-a-vis a contribution in Achaia for the Christians in Jerusalem, a contribution in Macedonia for the same, and an approaching journey of St. Paul to Jerusalem. This is an instance of conformity beyond the possibility, I would venture to say, of random writing to produce. I also assert that it is in the highest degree improbable that they should have been in effect a contrivance and design. In other words, Acts and Paul's letters don't clash, they independently reinforce one another with subtle, undesigned coincidences. That's not what you get from someone who never really traveled with Paul, as Ehrman also claims. So where does this leave us? Acts confirmed by Josephus and dovetailing with Paul's own letters? Wrong. Or Ehrman misreading Galatians, ignoring Acts 24, and accusing Luke of confusion or lying when the evidence says otherwise? Bart is forcing contradictions into the text that just aren't there. If you find these videos helpful, feel free to check out my Patreon and consider joining. You'll get early access to videos before they come out, be a part of our private group chat, and you'll help me to continue to put out content that spreads and defends the gospel. Thank you so much for watching.